Before we get into this story, subscribe if you believe the quietest evidence is usually the evidence that hurts the most, because Margaret Ellis did not find out about her husband's affair from lipstick on a shirt. She did not find perfume in his truck. She did not catch a midnight message lighting up his phone while he slept. No. The first thing that broke her marriage was 4 words on a bank statement. For our new place. That was all it said. 4 small words, typed into the memo line of an $18,600 transfer from the joint account Margaret used for groceries, mortgage payments, insurance bills, and their son's school expenses. For months, Richard had told her money was tight. He said business was unpredictable. He said everyone needed to be realistic. Then he walked into court and asked to lower child support. Then he told people he only wanted freedom. But when the court froze his accounts during financial discovery, the woman he had left Margaret for sent him one message that told the truth better than any confession ever could. I didn't leave my life for a man whose money is frozen. That was the moment Margaret finally understood what had really happened. She had not simply lost her husband to another woman. She had been helping pay for his escape. Margaret Ellis was 52 years old when her marriage began to fall apart, but it did not happen the way people imagine. There was no screaming match in the driveway, no dramatic confession at the kitchen table. No one packed a suitcase in the middle of the night and slammed the door hard enough to wake the neighbors. It started quietly, inside an ordinary house in Ohio. The kind of house where the garage door stuck whenever the weather got cold, where one kitchen drawer was full of old batteries and takeout menus, and where bills sat on the counter in neat little piles before Margaret paid them. She had been married to Richard for 24 years. 24 years is a long time to know the sound of someone's keys in the door. It is a long time to know how they take their coffee, which knee bothers them when it rains, and what kind of silence means they are tired instead of angry. Margaret worked as an office manager at a dental clinic. She knew insurance codes, late patients, nervous children, and which hygienist needed 10 extra minutes because the last appointment ran long. She was practical, sometimes too practical. She saved receipts in envelopes. She worried ahead of time. She could be stubborn about money, and she hated replacing anything that still worked. She was not glamorous. She was not trying to be. Margaret was the kind of woman who kept a life running. Richard worked in logistics and made more money than she did. For years, that had never felt like a problem between them. Their marriage was not built around keeping score. It was built around keeping the lights on, keeping the mortgage current, and keeping their son Ethan steady. Ethan was 15, tall for his age, still growing into himself. He played baseball and took it seriously in that quiet teenage way, like the game gave him a place to put all the feelings he did not know how to say out loud. Their life was not the kind of life people took pictures of for strangers to admire. It was school forms, insurance premiums, meatloaf on Wednesdays, and the leaky gutter Richard kept saying he would fix when he had a free weekend. It was arguing over whether the old SUV could survive another winter. It was Margaret checking the calendar on the fridge while Richard looked for his reading glasses, even though they were usually on top of his head. It was ordinary. And Margaret trusted ordinary. She believed real was better than impressive. She believed the long marriage did not have to sparkle every day. It just needed 2 people who still faced the same direction when life got heavy. For a long time, Richard seemed like that kind of man. He came home when he said he would. He remembered Ethan's dental appointments. He knew when Margaret needed help carrying groceries and when she simply needed 10 minutes of quiet after work. He talked about the house with pride, especially once they got close to paying it down. To Margaret, that was mature love. Not loud, not perfect, but dependable. Then Richard turned 55, and he started talking about getting healthy. At first, Margaret was proud of him. Honestly, she was relieved. He said he wanted to take better care of himself. He talked about cholesterol, sleep, stress, and wanting more years with his family. He joined a gym. He bought a fitness watch. He started measuring steps and reading labels, like a man who had suddenly discovered time was not unlimited. Margaret supported him. She cooked with less salt. She bought leaner meat. She stopped teasing him when he measured his portions at dinner. When he said he wanted to feel better in his own body, She believed him. She thought she was standing beside her husband while he did something good for himself. She did not know that self-improvement would become the first door Richard used to walk out of their marriage. The warning signs did not arrive loudly. They came dressed as discipline. Richard started staying later at the gym. First 20 minutes, then an hour, then 2. He bought fitted shirts, new sneakers, expensive cologne, and skin cream he laughed off as nothing special. He began looking at himself in the bathroom mirror differently, like he was waiting for a better version of himself to appear and applaud. He talked about energy now, mindset, reinvention, a new chapter. Margaret tried to be fair. A man in his 50s wanting to feel alive again was not a crime. A husband caring about his health did not make him guilty. But something in Richard's voice changed. He no longer sounded like a husband trying to get healthier. He sounded like a man rehearsing for a life where his family had become background noise. That was how Natalie Reed entered the marriage. At first, Natalie was just his wellness coach. That was the word Richard used. Coach. Clean, professional, harmless. He said Natalie understood recovery and nutrition. He said she understood sleep, stress, and the pressure men carried when everybody expected them to stay strong. Then, her name began appearing in conversations where it did not belong. Natalie said he should stop eating late. Natalie said men his age could still rebuild themselves. Natalie said most people died before they ever really lived. Margaret heard that name so often it started to feel like Natalie had her own place at the dinner table. When Margaret asked about it, Richard did not comfort her. He corrected her. He said she was insecure. He said she hated seeing him confident. He said she was attached to an older version of him because it made her feel safe. He said she needed to stop managing him like one of her dental appointments. That was the first real cruelty. Not the affair. Not yet. The cruelty was how he made Margaret feel ashamed for noticing what any wife would have noticed. Soon, Richard's self-improvement turned into a measuring stick, and Margaret was always on the wrong side of it. He criticized her clothes, her shoes, her grocery lists, the way she spent Saturday mornings paying bills instead of chasing some big new dream. He said she thought small. He said she had made comfort into a religion. He said she cared more about coupons and school emails than becoming anything meaningful. Then one night, while Ethan was upstairs and dinner sat cooling between them, Richard looked at Margaret and said, "You're comfortable because you stopped becoming anything." Margaret did not answer him. There are insults you can fight back against, and then there are insults that land so deep they make you quiet. After that, Richard came home late more often. Late wellness sessions, late work calls, late drives to clear his head. He laughed at texts he would not show her. He placed his phone face down beside his plate. He showered the second he walked through the door. He claimed work was draining him, but somehow he always had enough energy for 3 hours at the gym. Outside the house, Richard was building a new image. The reborn husband, the disciplined man, the 55-year-old who had finally chosen himself. Inside the house, he became colder, sharper, and harder to reach. Margaret slowly began to understand the pattern. He was not just changing his body, he was changing the story. And in that story, Richard was brave, Natalie was inspiring, and Margaret was the tired old chapter he needed to outgrow. What Margaret did not understand yet was that stories like that usually cost money. And on a Monday morning in early spring, the first receipt found her before she ever went looking for it. It came in the mail. Not from Richard's phone. Not from a secret account she broke into. Not from some late-night chase through a parking lot. Just a plain envelope from the bank, tucked between a grocery flyer and Ethan's baseball fundraiser. At first, Margaret thought it had to be a mistake. The notice mentioned a home equity line of credit connected to the house. Margaret read it once, then again. She was standing at the kitchen counter, still wearing her clinic badge, with coffee going cold beside her hand. She had not agreed to borrow against the house. She had not signed off on a renovation. Richard had not mentioned repairs, contractors, emergencies, or anything close to it. So Margaret opened the joint account, the one she had every right to access. And one by one, the numbers began to line up in a way that made her stomach go still. $18,600 to an apartment management company. $3,200 to N.R. Wellness Consulting. $1,100 to a jewelry store in a shopping district Richard always claimed he hated. $780 to a boutique hotel 40 minutes from their home. Then restaurants. Parking garages. Spa charges. More restaurants. All on evenings when Richard had said he was working late, training late, or too exhausted to talk. Margaret did not cry right away. Shock can be strangely dry at first. She kept scrolling until one line made the kitchen feel smaller around her. For our new place. 4 words. No apology. No explanation. Just a memo line, typed by a man careless enough to believe his wife would never look. Margaret sat down at the kitchen table. For years, that table had held permission slips, birthday cards, mortgage statements, grocery lists, and Ethan's unfinished homework. Now it held the first clean proof that Richard had been building another life, with money from the one she was still trying to protect. But Margaret did not drive to the gym. She did not call Natalie. She did not throw Richard's clothes into the yard. She did not write a public post so neighbors and cousins could gather around the wreckage. She printed the statements. She saved the PDFs from the joint account. She photographed the bank envelope, the date, and the notice about the home equity line. She wrote down every strange charge she could find and placed the papers inside a blue folder in her desk. That night, Richard came home irritated. He looked at the chicken Margaret had made and said there were too many carbs on the plate. Then he said he needed to be around someone who understood the version of him he was becoming. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked, "Is that what Natalie understands?" Richard froze for half a second. Not long, but long enough. Then he smiled in that tired, superior way and told her she was being paranoid. That was when Margaret decided to stay silent. Not because she was weak, because for the first time, she understood something that would save her later. Feelings could not defeat a man performing innocence. Only evidence could do that. The next morning, Margaret called Elaine Porter before her shift at the dental clinic. She was sitting in the parking lot with both hands on the steering wheel, even though the car was already off. The blue folder sat on the passenger seat beside her, thick with bank statements, printed PDFs, and the kind of proof a woman never wants to need. Elaine was 58 years old, and she had been a divorce attorney long enough to know that betrayal rarely arrives alone. It usually brings money with it. Property, children, pride, lies dressed up in reasonable explanations. When Margaret walked into her office later that afternoon, Elaine did not act shocked. That almost bothered Margaret at first. She had expected disbelief, maybe anger, maybe one of those sharp little reactions people give when they hear something ugly and want you to know they are on your side. But Elaine only put on her glasses, opened the folder, and began reading. She looked at the transfer. She looked at the memo line. She looked at the home equity notice. Then she leaned back slightly and said, "He was careless, where men like him usually think they're safest." Margaret asked where that was. Elaine tapped the paper with one finger. On paper. That sentence stayed with Margaret, because Richard had been careful in the places she had been looking. He was careful with his phone, careful with his tone, careful with the way he made everything sound like Margaret was too insecure, too old-fashioned, too afraid of change. But he had not been careful with the records. Elaine had seen men like Richard before, men who called an affair growth, men who called hidden money planning, men who called leaving a family choosing happiness. They often thought a prettier word could make an ugly thing respectable. Elaine did not work in pretty words. She worked in dates, records, signatures, account numbers, and trails of money people forgot they had left behind. She looked across the desk at Margaret and said, "According to your attorney, in your state, the evidence may matter, if we can show where the money went, when it went, and why it was hidden. Margaret sat very still. Until that moment, everything had felt like humiliation. Richard's late nights, Natalie's name appearing in the middle of dinner, the way he criticized Margaret's clothes, her food, her routines, even the carefulness that had kept their home steady for years. It had all felt personal. Elaine made it practical. She wrote down categories instead of feelings. Bank statements from the joint account, mortgage records, home equity line documents, tax returns, credit card statements, insurance records, business documents connected to Richard's logistics work and his new LLC, school emails, medical appointments, baseball schedules, text messages about pickups, cancellations, and who actually showed up when Ethan needed a parent. Margaret listened, nodding slowly, as if someone had just handed her a map in a room she had been crawling through in the dark. Elaine was firm about one thing. Margaret was not to hack Richard's phone. She was not to install anything on his devices. She was not to break into a private email account. She was not to follow Natalie, confront Natalie, or turn herself into the kind of woman Richard could point to and call unstable. Elaine said dirty evidence could damage a clean case, and Margaret had too much to protect. So Margaret went home and did the one thing she had always been good at. She organized. After Ethan went upstairs at night, she worked in the laundry room with the door half closed. She laid papers across the counter between detergent bottles and folded towels. Joint account statements went into one stack, mortgage history into another, school records into a third. Medical appointments, baseball schedules, and messages from teachers went into their own folder. Every charge involving Natalie, the gym, the apartment company, hotels, spas, restaurants, or consulting payments went into a folder Margaret labeled with one word: questions. That folder got thicker faster than the others. The more Margaret looked, the more she realized Richard had not simply drifted away from the marriage. He had been preparing an exit while still standing inside the life she was maintaining. He had opened a separate account. He had moved part of a work bonus through a small LLC called Ellis Performance Advisory. When Margaret had asked about that bonus weeks earlier, Richard had told her the company was holding funds for tax reasons. He said it with that patient, superior tone he used when he wanted her to feel embarrassed for asking. It was technical, he said. Business stuff. Nothing she needed to worry about. Now she understood what that meant. It meant he wanted her quiet. Then Richard began talking about cash flow. That became his new phrase. Cash flow was tight. The economy was uncertain. Business expenses were up. People did not understand how much pressure he was under. He told Margaret he could not be expected to carry everybody forever. He said if divorce happened, she needed to be realistic. He said he would not be able to pay much child support because his available income was not what people assumed it was. Margaret listened to those words differently now. Before, they might have frightened her. Now they just sounded rehearsed. Richard was not broke. He was rearranging himself. Then came custody. That one hurt in a place money could not reach. Richard suddenly wanted 50-50 custody of Ethan. On paper, it sounded noble. A father asking for equal time. A man refusing to be pushed out of his son's life. Richard even used that language at home, walking through the kitchen as if he were making some brave moral stand. He said Ethan needed his father. He said Margaret did not own their son. He said he would not be treated like a visitor in his own child's life. Margaret did not argue with the idea that Ethan needed a father. Of course he did. She had never wanted Richard erased from their son's life. But she knew the daily truth. She knew Ethan's allergy medication. She knew his math teacher's email. She knew which baseball nights left him too tired to eat much dinner. She knew the dentist appointment he was nervous about, and the history quiz he pretended not to care about. She knew the way Ethan got quiet when adults argued too close to him. Richard loved Ethan in moments. Margaret could admit that. But parenting is not just moments. Parenting is the boring middle. The forms, the drives, the late-night fever checks, The reminders, the parent meetings, the emotional weather no one else notices until it turns into a storm. Margaret had carried that part for years. Elaine explained the custody issue carefully. More parenting time could affect child support. Not always in a simple way. Not automatically. But enough that a man like Richard might see custody as part of a financial strategy. Margaret sat with that for a while. Then she said, very quietly, "He's using Ethan as a number." Elaine did not correct her. That silence told Margaret enough. 2 days later, Richard went lower. Ethan was at baseball practice. The house was quiet in that late afternoon way, with the dishwasher humming and the sun hitting the hallway floor. Richard stood near the stairs and told Margaret that if she wanted money from him, maybe they should make sure everything was really his. He did not say the word at first. He let it hang there because he knew what it would do. A DNA test. After 15 years. After birthdays and school photos and Little League games. After Ethan's pneumonia at age 9, when Margaret slept in a chair beside his bed while Richard answered work emails in the hallway. After every form Richard had signed as father. Now, because money was involved. He wanted to turn their son into a question. Margaret felt something inside her go cold. Richard did not want truth. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her angry, insulted, shaking, saying things he could later repeat to a lawyer. He wanted her to look emotional enough for his story to make sense. For 1 second, Margaret wanted to give him exactly what he deserved. She wanted to tell him what kind of man uses his own child as leverage. She wanted to remind him who sat up with Ethan when he was sick, who drove him to practice, who remembered the school deadlines, who made sure there was always food in the house while Richard was busy becoming someone new. But instead, she walked away. She called Elaine. Elaine told her not to take the bait. If Richard wanted a DNA test, they would handle it legally, cleanly, and without drama. Then Elaine said something Margaret never forgot. A person who uses DNA as a weapon against the mother of his own child is often trying to distract from something else. And during discovery, that something else, finally, started to show itself. Richard had not paid Natalie in one simple, obvious way. He had dressed the money up. He had moved it through labels that sounded almost respectable if you did not look too closely. Consulting fees, wellness coaching, apartment deposits, vehicle assistance, brand development, travel reimbursement. Each phrase had the same purpose, to make betrayal look like business. But Elaine did not skim paperwork. One payment connected to the apartment management company, another tied to furniture delivered to the same address. Another matched the weekend Richard claimed he was attending a logistics conference. There was no conference receipt. There was a hotel charge, 2 dinners, a spa package, and all of it was connected to a business card Richard had claimed was only for professional expenses. Elaine requested court involvement to examine the business accounts and trace marital funds. Margaret signed what needed to be signed. She answered what needed to be answered. She stopped trying to understand Richard's heart. Because his heart had become the least useful evidence in the room, she stopped asking why he had done this to her. That question was too soft now. The better questions were harder. Where did the money go? Who received it? When was it moved? Why was it hidden? That was when the story stopped being only heartbreak. It became a case. And Richard still did not understand that. He still believed Margaret was just a wounded wife trying to hold on to a man who had already chosen someone else. He thought sadness had made her weak. He thought embarrassment had made her quiet. He thought she was waiting for him to come back and choose her again. That belief made him careless. There is a special kind of arrogance in people who think they have already won. They stop hiding the shape of the knife. Margaret learned to live 2 lives at once. At home, she still folded Ethan's uniforms. She still made dinner. She still asked him about baseball. She still went to the dental clinic every morning and handled patients complaining about copays as if her marriage were not being taken apart in folders after work. When Richard spoke to her, she answered plainly, Not warmly, not cold enough to warn him, just plainly. That seemed to comfort him. He mistook quiet for defeat. But in Elaine Porter's office, my voice softens here. She sat across from Elaine with timelines, statements, calendars, and receipts. Together, they matched late gym sessions to hotel charges. They compared Richard's so-called work dinners to restaurants near Natalie's apartment. They placed school emails beside Richard's canceled pickup texts. They marked every time Margaret left work early for Ethan, while Richard claimed business obligations made him unavailable. Week by week, the picture sharpened. Then, financial discovery brought the detail that changed everything. Richard had not only helped Natalie, he had signed a lease connected to her apartment through his business account. He called it client housing. That was the phrase in the records. Clean. Corporate. Almost boring. But the address told the real story. It was the same address where Richard had sent flowers. The same address connected to food deliveries on nights he was supposedly at work. The same building tied to furniture purchases, parking charges, and a weekend delivery fee for a mattress Margaret had never seen. And then Elaine found the part that made Margaret sit back in her chair and close her eyes. Some of the money appeared to come from the home equity line attached to their house. The house where Ethan slept. The house Margaret had spent years helping protect. The house Richard once bragged they were close to paying down. He had quietly used that house as a source of cash for another woman's apartment. Elaine's voice stayed calm when she explained the next step. They would ask the court to restrict Richard from moving, selling, transferring, or draining certain accounts until discovery was complete. Not as revenge, as preservation. That word mattered. Preservation. Because Richard had treated the marriage like something he could strip for parts before walking away, Elaine intended to make sure there was still something left to divide, honestly. When Richard received the notice, the man who had spent months talking about peace, growth, healing, and brave new chapters finally showed Margaret what panic sounded like. He came into the kitchen that night, holding papers in one hand. His face was tight, pale around the mouth. "What did you do to my accounts?" he asked. Margaret was washing a glass. She rinsed it, set it carefully in the rack, and turned around. "I didn't freeze anything, Richard," she said. "The court did." His jaw moved once before he spoke. "You're trying to destroy my future." Margaret looked at him then. Really looked at him. At the man who had called selfishness freedom. At the man who had called secrecy planning. At the man who had called her suspicion insecurity while using their money to furnish someone else's life. "No," she said. "I'm documenting the future you tried to build with our money." Richard's anger shifted. When men like him lose one argument, they usually reach for another. He said she was poisoning Ethan against him. He said she wanted their son to grow up without a father. He said no decent mother would make custody ugly just to punish a man for moving on. Margaret left the room. When she came back, she had another folder. Inside were school emails, doctor visits, baseball schedules, missed pickups, text messages where Richard canceled at the last minute, and notes showing how many times Margaret had rearranged her workday because Richard's plans had changed. She placed it on the kitchen table. Richard stared at it. Margaret kept her voice low. "You don't want custody," she said. "You want a discount." That one landed. For once, he did not answer right away. He looked at the folder like it had spoken before she did. And for the first time, Margaret saw fear cut through his anger. Not guilt. Not regret. Not yet. Just fear that the story he preferred might not survive contact with the facts. Then Natalie began to disappear. At first, it was subtle. She stopped posting photos where Richard's hand could be seen at the edge of the frame. She stopped writing captions about second chances and brave love. Her messages became shorter. Richard spent more time outside on phone calls, lowering his voice whenever Margaret walked past a window or opened the back door. He looked less polished, less reborn. More like a man whose expensive fantasy had started charging interest. When Natalie learned the apartment could appear in court filings, and that the accounts connected to Richard were restricted, her devotion cooled quickly. Very quickly. She told him she needed space. That was the polite version. Then came the message Elaine later showed Margaret during discovery. I didn't leave my life for a man whose money is frozen. Margaret read it once, then again. There was no poetry in it, no grand love, no soul-deep connection. No brave new chapter written by two people who had found each other too late. Just a woman who had mistaken access for love. And a man who had mistaken being wanted for being valued. Richard had left his wife for a mistress. Then the mistress left him when the money stopped moving. And when they finally walked into court, Richard still tried to tell the old story. He wanted to be seen as a man chasing freedom, but Margaret did not need to argue with him anymore. Elaine only needed to open the file. The hearing was not dramatic in the way people like to imagine. Nobody shouted across the courtroom. Nobody stood up and made some perfect speech that left the room silent. The judge did not slam a hand on the bench and call Richard what he was. Real courtrooms are usually colder than that. Quieter. More patient. And in some ways, more dangerous. Because a courtroom does not need anger to ruin a lie. It only needs the lie placed beside the right document. Richard sat at one table with his attorney, wearing the same controlled expression he had practiced for months. Calm, reasonable, slightly wounded. He looked like a man who believed if he sounded balanced enough, the damage would look mutual. Margaret sat beside Elaine Porter with her hands folded in her lap. She had not slept much the night before. Not because she was afraid of Richard. That part had passed. She was afraid of what it meant to let strangers open the private rooms of her life and turn them into exhibits. A marriage can be messy in silence for years, but once it enters court, the mess gets labeled bank statement, text message, parenting calendar, mortgage record, transfer memo. That was humiliating in its own way. But Margaret had learned something by then. Shame belongs to the person who did the damage, not the person who finally brought the receipts. Richard's story was simple. Too simple. He said the marriage had been over for a long time. He said Margaret was controlling. He said she could not accept his growth. He said he wanted peace. He wanted freedom. He wanted to be an active father. Natalie, according to him, had nothing meaningful to do with marital money. The business expenses were ordinary. His income was not as high as Margaret believed. Child support needed to be realistic. 50-50 custody was about Ethan, not money. He said all of it with a steady voice. And maybe, for a moment, he almost believed it. That is the trouble with people who rewrite a story long enough. Eventually, they forget which parts they invented. Elaine did not rush. She did not accuse him of everything at once. She did not turn to the judge with outrage in her voice. Elaine was too experienced for that. Outrage can make the truth sound emotional. Elaine wanted the truth to sound unavoidable. So she started with the money. First came the bank records, then the business account statements, then the credit card charges, lease documents, payment memos, hotel receipts, and transfers. One after another, the clean little phrases Richard had hidden behind began to look thinner on paper. Wellness consulting, client housing, brand development, travel reimbursement. Those words had sounded professional when Richard used them at home. They had sounded technical, almost boring. The kind of thing a wife was supposed to stop asking about if she did not want to seem suspicious. But in court, beside the dates and amounts, they sounded like what they were. Cover. Elaine showed how the payments connected back to Natalie. She showed the apartment address. She showed the furniture charges. She showed the restaurant bills on nights Richard claimed he was working late. She showed expenses tied to weekends where there was no real business event, no conference registration, no hotel invoice connected to logistics, no meeting schedule, nothing that supported the story Richard had told. Just money, leaving the marriage and landing around Natalie. Richard stared straight ahead while Elaine spoke. Margaret watched his face carefully. For months, He had looked at her like she was too small to understand him. Now, he was being understood perfectly, and he did not seem to enjoy it. Then Elaine moved to the home equity line. That was the part that made Margaret's stomach tighten again, even though she already knew it was coming. Richard had claimed the money was connected to repairs, improvements, possible updates to the house, normal household planning. The kind of vague explanation that can float in the air at home because nobody wants to turn every conversation into an interrogation. Elaine asked for contractor invoices. There were none. She asked for material receipts. None. Permits? None. Work orders? None. There was no new roof. No remodeled bathroom. No repaired garage. No serious improvement to the house that Ethan slept in, or the kitchen Margaret stood in every night trying to keep dinner normal. What existed instead were transfers, personal charges, and payments that pointed away from the house and toward Natalie's life. The judge did not need Elaine to make it emotional. The documents were ugly enough on their own. Then came custody. Elaine did not call Richard a terrible father. That would have been too easy, and too easy is not always useful. Richard loved Ethan in moments. Margaret knew that. She had never claimed he did not. But parenting is not built out of moments people can perform when they need to look good. Parenting is patterns. Elaine presented the calendar. Margaret's work adjustments, Ethan's appointments, school emails, baseball schedules, prescription refills, teacher messages, canceled pickups, late arrivals, the quiet, boring, exhausting evidence of who had carried the daily weight before child support became part of the conversation. There were no dramatic words in those records, just dates, times, messages, and one pattern that could not be dressed up. Margaret had been the steady parent. Richard had been present when it suited him, absent when it cost him, and suddenly passionate about equal time after seeing what support might require. The timing mattered. Richard's request for 50-50 custody came after he received the child support projection, not before. That did not prove everything by itself. Court does not work that neatly. But it made his sudden interest look less like devotion and more like arithmetic. Margaret sat there listening, feeling something heavy press behind her ribs. She did not want Ethan turned into a calculation. She did not want their son reduced to a line in a financial argument. But Richard had opened that door. Elaine was only showing the court what was behind it. Then came the DNA test. The result confirmed what everyone in that room should have already known. Ethan was Richard's son. 15 years of birthdays, fevers, school pictures, baseball games, dentist visits, and signed report cards had not been erased by Richard's attempt to make fatherhood conditional when money became inconvenient. The test did not free Richard from responsibility. It only exposed the cruelty of the threat. Elaine did not overplay it. She did not have to. She simply laid out the timing, the language, and the context. A man who had raised a boy for 15 years had used paternity as pressure during a child support dispute. That did not help him. Not with the judge, and not with Margaret. Because once a man uses his own child as leverage, something permanent changes in the way you see him. The court did not give Margaret a fairy tale victory. Real life rarely does. There was no single magical ruling that fixed every humiliation, returned every dollar, and erased every night she had spent staring at the ceiling while Richard slept beside her like a stranger. But the orders were real, and real consequences can be heavier than dramatic ones. The restrictions on Richard's transfers stayed in place while the marital estate was reviewed. Child support was recalculated using a fuller picture of Richard's income, business benefits, and financial activity. Certain marital funds used around Natalie had to be addressed in the property division, including reimbursement for documented improper spending. Richard's request for immediate 50-50 custody was not granted, because the history did not support the performance. A more structured parenting schedule was put in place, one that protected Ethan's routine instead of Richard's image. The business money did not vanish behind the word business anymore. It was pulled into the discussion. The home equity issue remained under review. Richard was warned about incomplete disclosures. And for the first time since all of this began, he had to sit quietly while other people looked at the life he had tried to build in secret. Natalie did not come to court. That said enough. The apartment Richard had helped fund became evidence. The woman he had called his future became absent the moment his money became complicated. And Margaret, the wife he had described as small, bitter, jealous, and afraid of his growth, sat there with every receipt he thought she would never find. Richard did not collapse all at once. Men like Richard usually do not. He came apart gradually, first in his face, when he realized the judge was following the money, then in his shoulders, when custody stopped sounding like strategy, then in his hands, when the restrictions stayed in place and the room did not accept his version of freedom as something noble. For months, Richard had believed he was the author of the story. In court, he learned he was only one of the exhibits. When the hearing ended, Margaret did not feel joy. Not the loud kind. She felt tired, steady, relieved in a way that almost hurt. Richard walked out without looking at her. There was no mistress waiting in the hallway, no bright new chapter standing beside him, no reward for his reinvention, no one there to admire the man he had tried so hard to become. Just a husband facing the consequences of using family money to buy a fantasy, and then using his own child to lower the cost of leaving. By the end of that day, Richard was no longer the brave man choosing freedom. He was the husband who had hidden money, financed an affair, threatened a DNA test, and dressed greed up as growth. And the paperwork had said so. 3 weeks after the hearing, Richard came back to the house just after dark. Margaret saw him through the front window before he knocked. For a second, she almost did not recognize him. Not because his face had changed that much, but because the performance was gone. No new watch catching the porch light, no fitted gym shirt, no careful confidence, no clean little phrases about growth, freedom, healing, or becoming the man he was always meant to be. Just Richard. Tired. Thinner. Standing on the porch of a home he had tried to use as collateral for another woman's apartment. Margaret opened the door, but she did not invite him in. That was new. For 24 years, Richard had treated that doorway like something that would always open for him. No matter what kind of mood he brought home, no matter what words he had thrown at her, no matter how late he came back. This time, Margaret stood in the doorway and made him remain outside. Richard said he only needed a few minutes. Then he started talking. He said Natalie had used him. He said she only cared about money and the lifestyle he could give her. He said he had been confused, flattered, caught up in the feeling of being wanted again. He said he had lost sight of what mattered. Then he said the sentence men like him often find when the fantasy fails. He said family was what really mattered. Margaret listened without interrupting. That was the strange thing about peace. It did not make her louder. It made her less available for nonsense. Richard said he had made terrible choices. He said the divorce had gone too far. He said Ethan deserved parents who could try again. He said maybe they could rebuild something wiser now, something more honest, something stronger than before. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the years. Not just the bad months. The years. The mortgage payments. The baseball games. The dental appointments. The dinners. The birthdays. The quiet mornings when she had believed they were on the same side. The ordinary life he had treated like a cage the moment someone else made him feel young. Then she said, "You are not standing here because you remembered my value. You are standing here because the woman you chose left when the court froze your money." Richard lowered his eyes. For once, he had no polished answer. He asked for one more chance anyway. He said they had history. He said 24 years should mean something. He said people made mistakes. He said they could do it for Ethan. Margaret's voice stayed calm. You don't get to break a home, call it freedom, and come back when freedom gets expensive. That was all. She did not scream. She did not insult him. She did not call Natalie names. She did not list every wound and make him stand there while she reopened them. She did not need to win that conversation. The court had already handled the facts. Time would handle the rest. Richard stood there for a few more seconds, as if waiting for the old Margaret to return. The one who would soften because he looked tired. The one who would worry about where he would go. The one who would take his regret and confuse it with love. But that woman had been worn down, lied to, and finally educated. She was not cruel now. She was clear. Margaret wished him well in the plainest voice she had. Then she closed the door. After the divorce was finalized, Margaret moved into a smaller townhouse across town. It was not impressive. The kitchen was narrow. The backyard was tiny. The living room barely held the old couch and the coffee table Ethan refused to let her throw away. The hallway closet stuck if you pulled it too fast. But Ethan had his own room. The custody schedule was clear. Child support came through the system. Her accounts had only her name on them. And nobody in that house used the word growth like a weapon. For the first time in months, Margaret did not have to wonder where Richard was. She did not have to study his face for lies. She did not have to listen for the small change in his voice when he was hiding something. She did not have to keep dinner warm for a man who came home smelling like another life. Peace did not arrive all at once. It came slowly. Morning walks before work, quiet dinners with Ethan, coffee with old friends she had stopped seeing because her marriage had taken up too much space, a new calendar on the fridge, bills paid from an account Richard could not touch, a front door that stayed locked unless Margaret chose to open it. Some nights still hurt. Of course they did. 24 years do not disappear just because the paperwork is final. There were memories in old songs, in grocery aisles, in the sound of baseball on television, in the empty side of a bed she had once been grateful to share. But the pain was different now. It was honest pain. Not confusion. Not gaslighting. Not that sick feeling of being told you were insecure while your instincts were quietly saving you. Betrayal often wears beautiful language. It calls itself self-improvement. Freedom. Growth. Choosing happiness. And sometimes those words are real. Sometimes people do need to change. Sometimes marriages end without villains. Sometimes two people simply cannot carry the same life anymore. But if that growth needs hidden money, secret rent, false business expenses, and a child used to reduce support, then it is not growth. It is selfishness wearing better clothes. Richard had wanted Margaret to believe she was small because she valued stability. But stability was never weakness. Stability was the mortgage paid on time, the school form signed, the medicine remembered, the house protected. The child kept steady while a grown man chased applause and called it becoming. Margaret did not win because she became cruel. She won because she stayed patient long enough for the truth to stand up on its own. She won because she did not let rage ruin her case. She won because she understood that evidence has a quiet kind of power. And maybe most of all, she won because she finally stopped asking why Richard had not valued her. Some people only understand value after they lose access. By then, it is no longer your job to teach them. Margaret did not get the life she thought she was protecting. She got something smaller, quieter, cleaner, and in the end, that was enough. Because freedom is not always dramatic. Sometimes freedom is a narrow kitchen, a sleeping teenage son down the hall, a bank account with your name on it, and the knowledge that nobody gets to spend your loyalty like it is theirs to waste. If this story made you think of a red flag someone once told you to ignore, leave your thoughts below. And subscribe for more stories about betrayal, divorce, custody battles, evidence, consequences, and the quiet moment when someone finally takes their power back.